Welcome back to English Tales, where we bring you stories that inspire, move, and sometimes even surprise you. Today, we're diving into one of the most fascinating love stories in history, a tale of a king who dared to love differently. Ever wondered how a king fell in love? What challenges he faced when his heart chose someone the world didn't expect? And how far he was willing to go for love? Trust me, this is a story you won't forget. Now, this is part 2 of the journey, where things get even more intense and emotional. But if you haven't seen part 1, where we uncovered the king's lonely childhood, his struggles with royal life, and how he became one of the most beloved figures of his time, I highly recommend starting there. It sets the stage perfectly for what's coming next. So, whether you're here for the romance, the drama, or the history, stay tuned, because this is where the real story begins. Thanks for joining us and enjoy this story. Let's get started. Part 7, The Church. In the spring of 1936, Mrs. Simpson wrote a letter to her husband, Ernest. "Dear Ernest," she began, "you have been so kind to me. You are a good and strong man. But our marriage is over. I am in love with the king and I want a divorce. Please don't be angry. There's nothing you can do to change my mind. I'll always remember you, but I need to be free." Ernest replied right away. "Your letter arrived this morning. I will do as you ask, but I'll never stop loving you. If you ever need me, I'll always be here." That night, the king and Wallace met at a small restaurant in Piccadilly. Edward read Ernest's letter several times. "This is wonderful news," he said with a smile. "Nothing can stop us now." The next morning, when Edward came down for breakfast, Gordon Lang, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was waiting for him. "Good morning, Gordon," the king greeted him. "It's nice to see you again. What can I do for you?" For a moment, the Archbishop stayed silent. Then he opened a small black bag and pulled out 3 newspapers. "I've come to speak with you about Mrs. Wallace Simpson," he began. "The newspapers say you plan to marry her. Are these stories true, sir?" "Yes, Gordon," Edward replied firmly. "Wallace will be my wife." "But that's impossible," the Archbishop said. "You know what the Church believes about marriage and divorce. Divorce is wrong in the eyes of God." Edward smiled and asked, "Can I ask you some questions about God, Mr. Lang?" "Yes, of course, sir." "Is God happy when 2 people fall in love?" "Yes, sir, but—" "And is God happy when 2 people fall in love and get married?" "Yes, sir, but—" "And is God happy when 2 people fall in love, get married, and live happily together?" "Yes, sir, but—" "Then, Archbishop," Edward concluded, "Wallace and I will make God very happy. We are in love, we will get married, and we will live happily together." "But you don't understand, sir," Mr. Lang insisted. "The Church says divorce is wrong. Mrs. Simpson cannot leave her husband and then marry you. You must forget about her and find someone else. Please, sir, think again." "That's not possible," Edward said softly. "When Wallace is free, I will marry her." There was a long silence. The Archbishop looked down at the floor and shook his head. "You're making a big mistake, sir," he said. "The Church is very powerful, and we will not accept this woman as our queen." Suddenly, Edward stood up, his face red with anger. "Thank you for coming," he said firmly. "But I have nothing more to say. I want to be alone." The Archbishop stood up to leave, but turned back to touch the king's arm. "Please, sir, reconsider. The church will oppose you." "I don't care," Edward replied. "I have God on my side, and that's all I need. Goodbye, Mr. Lang." Part 8. The Storm. In July and August, Wallace and the king set sail across the Mediterranean. They visited important leaders like Prime Minister Metaxas in Greece, Kemal Ataturk in Turkey, and King Boris in Bulgaria. But what made that summer unforgettable wasn't their meetings. It was Edward's clothes. On the journey from Athens to Istanbul, the king decided to take off his shirt to soak up the sun. It was scorching hot, and within 10 minutes, he fell asleep. Unbeknownst to him, a young photographer snapped pictures of the shirtless king. When Edward returned from his trip, a letter was waiting for him. It was from Mr. Albert Thompson of Birmingham, who wrote, "I saw your picture in the newspaper this morning and I felt very angry. I've never seen a king dress so poorly. No shirt, no tie, no socks, no hat, and wearing shorts. How could you, sir?" Edward showed the letter to Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister. "What do you think of this?" the king asked. "Mr. Thompson is right, sir," Baldwin replied. "You want to be modern, but the people don't like it." Edward tossed the letter into the fire. "And do you think divorce is modern, Mr. Baldwin?" The Prime Minister sat down, looking serious. "Yes, sir," he began. "I've read about Mrs. Simpson. She has 2 living husbands. You must understand what that means, sir. She cannot marry a king." "But I can't live without her," Edward said firmly. "Then, sir," Baldwin continued, "I see a storm coming. I've spoken to your family and Archbishop Lang. We will not accept Mrs. Simpson as our queen." That night, the Prime Minister and the king talked for hours. There were hundreds of questions, but only one answer. In the early hours of the morning, Edward finally spoke. "You tell me that Wallace cannot marry a king. Then there's only one thing I can do. I'll give the crown to my brother and leave England. I must follow my heart. You say it's a crime to fall in love. You say it's wrong to be happy. What a strange country this is." An hour later, Edward called Wallace. "The Prime Minister says a storm is coming," he told her. "I want you to go away." Wallace packed her bags and left for France. Then Edward went to see his mother. It was a sad, tense, and emotional meeting. "Do you know what you're doing?" Queen Mary asked sharply. "Look out that window. Outside this palace, there are 400 million people who call you king. They need you. And you'll abandon all this for Mrs. Simpson?" "Yes, mother, I will," Edward replied. "I'm in love." "Love?" Queen Mary shouted. "You're a king. You must love your country first." "But I'm also a man," Edward said softly, "and there's nothing I can do." That afternoon, the king called Winston Churchill, one of his closest friends. "I have some bad news," Edward began. "Last night, Mr. Baldwin came to see me. I've decided to leave next week." "Do you mean on holiday, sir?" Churchill asked, confused. "No, Winston. I'm leaving England. I'm never coming back. George will be king." "But that's not right, sir," Churchill protested. "You're a free man. You must stand and fight." "No," Edward said. "I've seen war, and it's a terrible thing. I don't want to fight again." "But the people love you," Churchill argued, "and they want Wallace to be queen." "Perhaps they do," Edward replied. "But she cannot be queen. My enemies are stronger than I am. I'm just a sailor. When the winds change, the sea moves, and it takes my boat away." Part 9. the woman I love. A few days later, Winston Churchill visited Edward at Buckingham Palace. At first, the king stayed quiet. Then he finally spoke. "This is my last night in England, Winston. I love this country. I wanted to be a modern and kind king. I wanted to change the world, but they stopped me. Now I have no choice but to leave." It was 10 o'clock. Edward stood up and walked to the window. Outside, in the dark streets below, hundreds of people had gathered. They were singing and shouting his name. "Edward! Edward! We love Edward! Long live the king! Long live love!" "But the people love you," Churchill said softly, "and they want Wallis to be queen." Suddenly, the king turned to Churchill, tears in his eyes. "Why is this happening to me, Winston?" he cried. "What have I done wrong?" He sat down, burying his head in his hands. The room fell silent, but the voices from the street continued to echo through the open window. "Long live Edward! Long live love!" Churchill walked over and placed a hand on the king's arm. Edward looked up. "Thank you, Winston," he said. "You've been a good friend to me." "Thank you, sir," Churchill replied. "And you were a good king." At 10 o'clock the next morning, the phone rang in Edward's bedroom. A voice said, "They're ready for you now, sir." The king walked slowly down the stairs. Ahead of him was an open door. His family was waiting inside. His mother sat near the window, dressed in black. His brothers stood beside her. How close they are, Edward thought bitterly. In the center of the room, on a small table, lay a piece of paper. Edward sat down and read the words aloud. "I, Edward the Eighth, King of Great Britain, King of India, King of Australia, King of New Zealand, King of Canada, King of Kenya, King of Nigeria, King of Burma, King of Malaya, King of Singapore, and King of 32 other countries, have today given the crown to my brother George. God be with him and all his people." December 10th, 1936. Edward picked up a pen and signed his name at the bottom of the page. Then he stood up and kissed his brother's hand. "I never wanted this to happen," George said sadly. "This is the worst day of my life." Edward walked over to his mother. She looked at him sternly. "Before I kiss you," she said, "there are some things I need to say. I've never understood you, child. This morning, you were a king, but tonight, you'll run from England like a thief, alone, angry, afraid. You think you're free, but you're not. You cannot be free." She paused, her voice softening. "I love you. I am your mother, and nothing can change that. But if you marry that woman, you will break my heart. Everyone needs their family, everyone needs their home, and tonight you have lost both those things." Edward kissed his mother's hand. Then he turned and walked away without looking back. The next day, Edward returned to Windsor Castle. He went into a small, cold room at the top of the building. From there, he spoke on BBC radio to Britain and the world. This is what he said. "Tonight, for the first time, I can speak directly to you. Earlier today, I gave the crown to my brother George. He is now your king. I will soon leave this country and travel to France. My heart belongs to Wallis, and I cannot live without the woman I love. I don't know what will happen to me. Perhaps I will never see England again. But think of me tonight as I sail across the sea. God be with you. Long live King George." After the broadcast, Edward left Windsor Castle and got into a large black car. It was midnight, and the rain had just begun to fall. "Take me away as quickly as you can," he told the driver. The car sped off into the darkness and the rain. "What a night," the driver remarked. "I think the sky's crying, sir." At 1:30 a.m., they arrived at Portsmouth. As Edward stepped out of the car, someone shouted, "The king is here!" Edward stopped and gazed out across the open sea. A thin, cold smile crossed his face. "King?" he said quietly. "No, I am not the king. I am just a man in love." Then he turned and walked onto the ship, disappearing into the night. Part 10. The Wedding. The next morning, Edward called Wallace from Boulogne. "Did you listen to me on the radio?" he asked. "Yes, of course," she replied. "And how did you feel?" "I was sitting alone in my room," Wallace said. "When I heard your words, I felt so sad. I covered my face with my hands and cried. I couldn't stop myself. You've left everything for me. But I love you so much, Edward. With me, you'll be the happiest man in the world." "I'm already that," Edward replied. "You are all that matters in my life." 6 months later, on June 3rd, 1937, Edward married Wallace Simpson. None of the royal family attended the wedding. Edward was 43 and Wallace was 41. Together, they took a new title, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. A few weeks later, Edward wrote to his brother, King George. "I was surprised that you didn't come to the wedding," he wrote. "But Wallace is now my wife, and nothing can change that. We have a house in Paris, but France is not my home. I want to live again at Windsor with Wallace by my side." King George replied, "I'm sorry, Edward. But you know how I feel about that woman. I do not like her, and I never will. You can live here, but Wallace cannot." "My brother pushed me away like a dog," Edward later said. "I'll never forget what he did. After that, I decided I didn't want my family. They didn't want Wallace, and so I didn't want them." Part 11. Paris. For the next 30 years, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor lived in Paris. They hosted grand parties and traveled the world, but they never returned to Buckingham Palace. When King George died in 1952 and Queen Mary passed away in 1961, Edward briefly visited Windsor, but Wallace stayed behind in France. "It's your family," she told him, "not mine." Then, in 1966, something remarkable happened. The Duke and Duchess met Queen Elizabeth II, King George's daughter, at a small gathering in London. After 30 long years, it seemed the past was finally being laid to rest. Queen Elizabeth kissed Wallace and gently touched her arm. Turning to Edward, she said warmly, "Wallace is so beautiful, Uncle. I think you're a very lucky man." "That day, Elizabeth was very kind to us," Edward later wrote. "But why couldn't my mother or my brother say those words to me?" In 1969, the Duke and Duchess appeared on BBC television to talk about their life together. "Do you ever argue?" someone asked them. "No, not really," the Duchess replied with a smile. "But there's one thing about my husband that drives me crazy. He's always late. It doesn't matter if he's meeting a queen, a president, or a movie star. He can never arrive on time. I've tried to change him, but it's impossible." The Duke chuckled and took her hand. "I admit I'm often late," he said. "But on our wedding day, I arrived at the church 20 minutes before you. I was early and you were late." "Yes, that's true. the Duchess said, laughing along with him. One newspaper wrote, "You could see real love in their eyes," Edward later recalled. They were on television, but they forgot about the cameras and the millions watching. They were just two people deeply in love. Wallis was famous for her stunning jewelry collection. "After my husband," she once said, "I love jewelry more than anything else in the world." Over 35 years, she had gathered hundreds of exquisite pieces from all corners of the globe. "I've never met a more beautiful woman than Wallis," Edward wrote. "She has brought me so much happiness. I buy her jewels to say thank you." In May 1972, the Duke fell seriously ill. When the doctor arrived, he listened to Edward's heart and asked, "How many cigarettes do you smoke each day, sir?" "About 40 or 50, the Duke replied. "But please don't ask me to stop. I've smoked for 60 years and I can't change now." That night, Edward called Wallis into the room. "I feel very tired," he said softly, "and I'm afraid. I love you so much. You've been the most wonderful wife, and you've given me so much happiness. When I die, I want you to take my body back to Windsor. Will you do that for me?" "Yes, of course," she said, tears streaming down her face. They held each other and cried. The Duke of Windsor passed away an hour later, with Wallis by his side. 3 days later, a blue airplane landed in Paris. Wallis accompanied Edward's body back to England, and for the first time in her life, she entered Buckingham Palace. A week later, the Duchess returned to Paris. For the next 14 years, she lived alone in their large house. The rooms grew dark, the doors remained locked, and she rarely went outside. In the afternoons, she would sit in the dining room, surrounded by Edward's love letters. "They were so beautiful," she said. "I read them over and over again." But in 1986, Wallis fell ill. She was taken to a nearby hospital, where she passed away a few days later. "Without Edward," she once wrote, "my life was empty." She was buried in England, next to her beloved husband at Windsor. One newspaper reflected, "It's strange. When they were alive, the Duke and Duchess could never live in Britain. It was only in death that they found peace together." Part 12. Long Live Love. In 1970, 2 years before his death, Edward shared these heartfelt thoughts. "Some people think I made a mistake giving up my crown, but they don't understand true love. When I was young, I lived in Buckingham Palace. I had everything I could ever want, but I wasn't happy because my heart felt empty. Then I met Wallis, and everything changed. For half of my life, I've lived here in Paris with the most beautiful woman in the world. She means everything to me. When I sit in my garden with the Duchess by my side, I often think about my early years. I remember the lonely nights in my bedroom. I remember the teacher who hit me with a stick. I remember the war and my travels around the world. And then I remember the crowds below my window, shouting, 'Long live love.' On my last night in London, I spoke with Winston Churchill. In the middle of our conversation, he said, 'Sir, I believe the best things in life are free.' I've never forgotten those words. Now, many years later, I truly understand what they mean. You can't buy happiness, and you can't buy love. To be happy deep inside your heart is the greatest gift in the world. I've been a lucky man, and so I say, thank God for Wallis, and long live love." Moral: the legacy of love and sacrifice. The story of Edward and Wallace is not just a tale of romance, it's a powerful reminder that love often requires sacrifice. Edward gave up the crown, wealth, and even his family to follow his heart. Wallace stood by him through decades of exile, proving that true love isn't about grand gestures, but about unwavering commitment. Together, they showed us that happiness doesn't come from titles or riches. It comes from finding someone who makes your heart whole. But this story isn't just about them. It's about us. It challenges each of us to think deeply about what truly matters in life. Are we chasing material success, or are we building meaningful connections? Are we living authentically, or are we letting fear hold us back? Imagine if more of us had the courage to prioritize love and authenticity over societal expectations. What kind of world could we create? This story reminds us that greatness isn't measured by power or possessions. It's measured by the depth of our relationships and the sincerity of our choices. So ask yourself, what would you give up for love, for happiness, for truth? Edward once said, "To be happy deep inside your heart is the most wonderful thing in the world." That's a lesson we can all carry with us, whether it's in our relationships, careers, or personal growth. If this story inspired you, take a moment to reflect on your own life. Who are the people who matter most to you? Have you told them how much they mean to you lately? Here's something to think about. What small step can you take today to strengthen your relationships or live more authentically? Maybe it's calling a loved one, expressing gratitude, or simply being present for someone who needs you. Let's take inspiration from Edward and Wallace's journey and strive to live lives filled with love, courage, and purpose. Because when we choose to lead with our hearts, we become kings and queens in our own right. Final thought. Remember, the greatest treasures in life aren't the ones we wear or display. They're the moments we share, the bonds we nurture, and the love we leave behind. So go ahead, take that first step toward making a difference. After all, the world is waiting for leaders like you. What's stopping you? Start now.